Hi, my name's Jon Cattapan. I moved to St Kilda properly in 1981, but I lived in a close proximity to St Kilda in a suburb called Albert Park from the late 70s, and I saw all of those great changes in St Kilda from about that time. My first real knowledge of St Kilda was as a very young person studying Australian art history, and so my knowledge of St Kilda came via people like Nolan and Boyd and of course Tucker with his images of modern evil, which I became very, very interested in. And it was interesting that when I first moved to St Kilda, Albert Tucker was still living there on the corner of Blessington Street and Herbert Street. So I guess I hadn't formed an opinion about what St Kilda was, except that I was always attracted to the beach. I grew up very close to the beach as a child, and St Kilda was like this exotic version of going to the beach. It was always a very interesting day out going there, even as a very young person. So it was a natural, I think, progression to think of St Kilda as a slightly alternative place. When I started art school in 1975, I had very long curly hair and I used to get around in cheesecloth tops. By the end of 1976, I had very close cropped hair and a skinny black tie and stovepipe pants. And hilariously, when you went to St Kilda, that was absolutely the uniform. St Kilda in the late 70s and into the very early 80s was a slightly less salubrious place than it is now. There was a lot of crime, there was drugs, there was prostitution. It was a fascinating place because there was also a rapid influx of what we might call the arty types coming in, a lot of them coming in from the suburbs, of course. So by the early 80s, there was a terrific momentum that was building with lots of young writers, some fabulous young musicians who'd started coming in from the late 70s, poets, and of course visual artists. And so that whole potpourri of people, the older style St Kilda inhabitants that were living in the boarding houses and so on, and frequenting the local pubs, mixing in with the younger artist types, was, I thought, a really interesting moment to be there. In St Kilda, in the late 70s and early 80s, rents were very, very reasonable. And it's not something necessarily that young artists find out about until perhaps it's a little bit too late, that, the idea of being able to make work requires a cheap workspace. So as an example, the flat that I had in St Kilda, which was a 2-bedroom flat, was $42 a week. And that, in those days, you might be making, $300 or $400, $300 a week. So comparative to what a person might be earning, the price of the flat was very, very achievable. And I'm acutely aware of how expensive rentals are right now, and it makes it a lot more difficult, I think, for people who want to be in those inner urban areas. It doesn't matter whether you're in St Kilda or now more probably Footscray or Brunswick or even Thornbury, Coburg, even out that way, rents are very expensive. One of the things I've been thinking a lot about lately is how we sort of transacted as artists, if you like, pre-internet, pre-social media, all of those things. And this is where an epicentre of activity becomes so very important. So having a little nucleus of activity, being St Kilda, where you could bump into artists at the local pub or musicians, or you could set up, you know, a collaboration over a coffee with someone because you were bound to bump into them, that was very, very useful. And it was so useful that it was hard to imagine not being within that, you know, couple of kilometre radius of that little epicentre. Of course, as you move on as an artist, other things start to take priority. One of the things that used to happen a lot in those days is people would just drop in on each other. No phone call. There were no mobile phones, you know, and likely as not, in those very early days, people wouldn't even have a phone line. You know, they might, but they might not. And so the culture of just turning up on someone's door and knocking on the door and expecting that you could have a drink or whatever, that was just a very natural thing. It was very organic. There was very little pre-planning. And there was also very little real ambition. You know, if you know the way things have gone now, artists coming out of art school have, I think, a much more developed sense of ambition and what's at stake, partially because it's expensive now to go to art school. I mean, I was blessed to be what I call one of Whitlam's babies, so we paid nothing to go to art school, and that was another real blessing and a great bit of luck. Now the stakes are a little bit higher, rents are very high, people think about what actually they can do and what career trajectory they might have. The times we lived in the very early days in St Kilda, it seemed like we had all the time in the world. You know, there was a lot of time spent just talking about ideas and inventing other ways of trying to be an artist. We were enabled in a very intuitive way. There wasn't a set of mechanisms that helped us along. This is what you do next. This is the curator you need to go and talk to. Oh, you need to go and visit this person because she has X, Y, or Z that might be available to you. It just kind of happened, word of mouth. It happened in a way that we felt comfortable with. You'd approach people, and in a way that was a really beautiful, very, very lucky time to be an artist. Lots of things were breaking. There were lots of ideas around. You know, we were very, very influenced, I think, by the bands who were playing. A lot of them very young musicians, as we were young artists, who were just getting up and having a go. No big musical careers at stake, just having a go. And it was a little bit like that, being an artist. And you could do that without people looking over your shoulder in the way that happens now with social media, where you have, you know, artists are, I think, not at their best when they feel they are having to perform to an end, such as, you know, the next post I have to do this. That I think, you know, there's a little bit of self-censorship that starts to take place then. What do I post next? You know, how do I develop this? You know, what political angle am I going to explore? That was all there, but it was really muddy and messy, and that was good because we were growing up. You know, we were developing our own skins without them being applied to us, if you know what I mean. After a period of living in Italy, and thinking about what my art could be. So this was 1985, and I'd already been making work in and around St Kilda for quite a while. I moved back to Melbourne and moved back to St Kilda, and I found myself being really strongly influenced by the nightlife in and around St Kilda, but also more generally the kind of nocturnal stories, if you like, that St Kilda offered. And so it was very influential living there. In that mix was my association with lots of different bands on the periphery, you understand. I was never in a band myself, but there was a moment there where I shared a studio in a big house in Burnett Street with a band called the Sacred Cowboys, who were like a really iconic St Kilda band for a few years. And then that in turn, the stories from following them around to gigs and so on fed back into the work in various ways. Never specifically though. I was kind of interested in my work having a little bit more of a universal feel than it being about a specific moment. But often in the work it was driven by a specific event, a church fire, a big boarding house fire in Burnett Street, a drug overdose that I had witnessed, and so on and so forth. They were just markers, and they were inspirations to sort of tease the work out. There were lots of different things in the work, but I guess ground zero was always the relationship, firstly to St Kilda, and then beyond that the relationship to Melbourne itself. I had decided that the idea of using Melbourne as a kind of absolute marker for the work would be another kind of way of coming at a self-portrait, not necessarily of myself, but a portrait of the times that I was living in. I had a studio in my apartment. I had a small 2-bedroom flat, and I gave over the larger bedroom to being my studio, and that spilled out to kind of overtaking the entire flat. That happens when you're kind of really obsessed with making at that younger age. And then from there I moved on to a studio in Burnett Street, as I said, where I spent some really interesting times in and around the band. And then I found, almost by total luck, a really big empty warehouse in Middle Park, and it had been empty for quite a long time. And in those days you could do a rate search and find out who owned the property, and I did, and I wrote the person a letter, old style, and he rang me up and he said, as a matter of fact, it's empty, and if you like, I'll give you a 3-month lease, and if that's good, then I'll give you a 12-month lease and we can take it from there. So I invited some fellow artists to move in, and we ended up staying there for 16 years. So it was, a pretty happy time actually. We really loved the idea of working in and around St Kilda. We were close enough to being there, but a little bit apart from it, so I could get some distance as well. Whenever I come back to Melbourne or came back to Melbourne, it was always St Kilda that I would gravitate back to straight away. And that's basically because for me, there's like a time capsule of memories there. It was a very great and, as I said, easy time to be a part of things. St Kilda was very special also because it had, of course, great beaches. There was Luna Park, there was the wonderful music venues, the Crystal Ballroom, the Prince of Wales, the Esplanade and so on. So there was a ready-made nightlife. You didn't have to travel very far. It all happened within a few blocks. It also had a kind of seamier side, which for a younger artist of my persuasion became something of an inspiration in the work. And I think, places move on. The St Kilda that I go back to visit now is not that St Kilda anymore. And yet there is still something wonderful about St Kilda. It's got a great council that supports the arts. There is a sense that people still travel into St Kilda to have a bit of fun, whatever that might be. And I think that's a really beautiful thing that in a way has always been there, that it's been a site of entertainment. So if you go back further to the period, for example, when Murkamura, Albert Tucker, Nolan and so on were all around in that area, there is, I think, building on from that, a natural trajectory that it is a place where artists and people who are a little more bohemian could congregate more easily. Not so much now because, things have, as I said, things have changed. There was a very interesting block of apartments which is now a set of luxury apartments on the Upper Esplanade. It was called Lieber Court Apartments. There's a very important Australian painter there who lived in that block. His name's Ken Wisson. He lived there for many years. As a student, I went with a group of other students to visit him in what was an incredibly humble abode, but he had everything there. He had his whole studio set up in the 3 rooms of his apartment, and he had this gorgeous view out over Port Phillip Bay, and a lot of those early paintings of his are of container ships and very abstracted forms, but they're based on what he actually saw. So those sorts of memories for me are kind of priceless in a way, but they're also gone now. So when I go back to St Kilda now, it seems like a lot of other places in Melbourne, and indeed a lot of other places in the world. And partly, of course, that's because the world is a global place. So Melbourne is like Singapore, is like London, is like Delhi, is like New York, etc. And a place like St Kilda is not immune to that. Even with that, though, it still has this little kernel of stuff. I'm not sure what, some kind of weird X factor that it's got, and it just feels really good to me, at least, to be back there. In my opinion, the way that an artist lives and works in the world today offers less scope for dreaming. And for me, the idea of having a big studio where we are today, and me coming here now that I have the time available to me every day, not necessarily making a lot of work, but dreaming about the possibilities of work as much as making it. This is so very important, I think. And it really goes to what it is to be not just an artist, but what it is to be a human being. To be able to dream sets us apart from a lot of other sentient beings. And it also, as AI starts to really take hold, sets us apart, at least for the moment, until someone teaches AI how to dream. It sets us apart in terms of creative beings, in terms of being makers. So if I go back to the early days of St Kilda, And that possibility of these, they were endless days. A lot of my early memories of St Kilda revolve around long days in the sun, talking nonsense with people. They were generous times. It didn't cost much to live. Many of us were on the dole. It was actually a very generous arts support system, the early dole system, because it was cheap to live, so you could kind of manage, it'd be a bit hand to mouth, but you'd manage. Just couldn't do that anymore now. So yes, those were lucky days, and I met people who have become lifelong friends, fellow artists, musicians, writers. They informed the way I still make my work. They critiqued my work properly in the way that good friends can do. And that's very important. It's very important to have that circle still. So that's all part of the memory of having grown up in St Kilda.